Ma, Sahotchifat Ibitana, Chikasha Saya and Chachapta Saya, Director, American Indian Studies Center Saya, Ashlakachukma, Gabrielino Tongva, Oblako Yagnimako, Apisahanchi, Ika Natoka, Hachimonolimi. Greetings, everyone. I greeted you and welcomed you in the Chickasaw language. I told you my Chickasaw name, which is Ihuitana, and told you that I am Chickasaw and Choctaw by descent and a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. I'm also, I have the honor of serving as the director of the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. I acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavanga, which encompasses much of what is currently called Los Angeles, as well as the South Channel Islands, and upon which the American Indian Studies Center and UCLA reside. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukvitam ancestors, Ahihiram, elders, and Eohinkem, our relations, relatives, past, present, and emerging. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Shannon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pamela J. Peters. I am the Operations and Event Coordinator of the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. As a Dene woman living here on Tavangar, I too would like to pay my respects to the Tongva ancestors, the elders, and all the relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. I also feel it's important to acknowledge our tribal relatives' homeland, and I do understand as a Dene woman, my homeland is the Navajo Nation, and I am a visitor here. Welcome everyone to this afternoon's talk about teaching children about American Indians through appropriate children's literature and animated programs with Debbie Reese and Princess Johnson. This will be moderated by Clement Bordeaux. And for the first portion of the afternoon, Clementine will ask a series of questions and introduce both Debbie and Princess. And then thereafter, we will open up the discussion to the audience for questions, and you can address your questions in the chat box. If you do address a question in the chat box, please include your name followed with your question, and we will gather them all and address them to both Debbie and Princess. I do want to bring Clementine to the forefront, but I wanted to give a brief introduction of Clementine Bordeaux. She is Oglala Lakota. She is a doctoral candidate in the World Arts and Culture doctoral program at UCLA. Clementine received her master's degree from the University of Washington in Seattle, Washington, through the Native Voices Indigenous Documentary Film Program, and is an undergraduate and received her undergraduate degree in theater from Cartridge College. Clementine Bordeaux.
Hi everyone, Tayama Chianke, it's good to see you all. So I'm gonna first introduce Debbie, and we're gonna share a quick PowerPoint as I introduce our panelists. So Debbie is tribally enrolled at the Nambe Owingeh, a sovereign nation in what is now known as New Mexico. Her research articles and book chapters on the depictions of Native peoples and children books are taught in education, library sciences, and English courses in the US and Canada. She grew up at Nambe and has worked as a teacher and assistant professor. With Dr. Jean Mendoza, she adapted Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's History of Indigenous People into an edition for young folks. An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States for Young People was named as an honor book by the American Indian Library Association's Youth Literature Award Committee in 2020. And I will start with Debbie, and as she shares her slides, I would like her to reflect on her journey and what brought her to working with children's literature and working with stories about Native children.
All righty, well, Kunta, that's Tewa for thank you. Thank you for everybody that made this gathering happen, and Kunta to all of you who are tuned in. If we could scroll to the first slide in the PowerPoint, that's where we could begin. Okay, so I left my reservation in northern New Mexico to study family literacy at the University of Illinois. I was told there was a mascot here, And my reply was that, oh, that's not going to be a big deal. I got here, it was a huge deal. I didn't understand how one person after another would seem to welcome me. And then when they'd ask my opinion on the mascot, and I said it was stereotypical and it was a problem and it misinformed people, young and old, then I got the cold shoulder. People didn't like that answer. And though I intended to study family literacy, which is look at reading children's books, I realized that there was something important happening that I needed to think about. And so I started looking at images of Native people in children's picture books, and found a lot of examples of picture books that are the kinds of things that moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas buy for their kids at Target or at Walmart or at Kmart, like Clifford the Big Red Dog. There is a Clifford's Halloween where that darling, adorable red Clifford is dressed up like an Indian, and suddenly he's not adorable and sweet anymore. He's got this very stern look on his face, and he's got face paint on, and he's got a big feathered headdress, and he's got one paw raised up in the air like if he's going to say how. So Clifford the Big Red Dog and Berenstain Bears, there is one where the Berenstain Bears go to camp, and that is the same kind of thing. At the camp, they're like sitting around a campfire, and Grizzly Bob's got this headdress on, and he's telling these stories, and he's being all somber. And so those were the ones you get at the dime store. But then the kinds of books that teachers give to kids have the same kind of problems in them. And so I started noticing how prevalent those were, and I shifted from an interest in family literacy just to an issue of representation of Native people in children's books. So I've been doing that for like 30 years, and was following and working alongside some people in Wisconsin. You could go to the slide with the 2015 data on it. Back one more, whoops, the 2015 data, we'll get there. The Cooperative Center for Children's Books in Madison gathers data on children's books that are published every year. So the publishers send all of the books to that are published in a given year to the center, and they read the books there and categorize them. And so what they have been doing yearly is generating these lists of how many books get published under what category. And in 2015, we created this infographic, because for years we'd had the data, we had the numbers, but that's boring. We needed something really captivating and intriguing, and we hit on the idea that we could create these infographics. So this was the first one that we did in 2015. And it brings the data from the center together with an idea in children's literature. There's this idea that if a book has something in it that looks like you or your people or your family or your land, it's a mirror of your experience. That idea is that children's books can be mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. It was put forth by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. She's a professor, retired now, from the Ohio State University. So Dr. Bishop's mirrors metaphor is what we used to create this infographic. We have, you see on the far right, a white child has lots of mirrors. There's 73.3% of the books that came out that year had enough content in them that the people at the center decided, okay, that's where this book goes in this category. So a white child, male or female, doesn't matter, has all of these mirrors that they can see that reflect them in some way. And if you look at the far left, you see that the children on the left are Native and children of color, and they don't have that many mirrors, because the numbers of books that come out every year that have enough content in them to be reflective of them in some way are much smaller. So those are very tiny numbers. This was the 2015 graphic. But what we realized as people were using the graphic was that there was an idea that that 0.9%, what we see there for the Native child, those were all good books. But we knew they're not, because a lot of them have stereotypes in them. They have Brother Eagle, Sister Sky, which is a misrepresentation of Seattle speech. Those kinds of books that have Native content in them, but are created by non-Native people who don't know what they're doing and misrepresent and appropriate and do all kinds of really terrible things to the story. So we added in the 2018, you can go to the next slide. In 2018, we added the idea that those mirrors are broken, that they are distorted and they're not good reflections of the children. So you see there on the far left, the Native child has, and the other children on the far left, they all have shards of glass at their feet that are pieces of their mirrors that have broken off and fallen to the ground because their mirrors aren't good. There's way more bad content out there than there is good content. When I look at that little boy there, the Native child on the far left, 23 books in 2018, but when I read those 23 books, there's only about 10 or 11 that I would recommend, that I would hand to a Native family or to a Native child. The others I would not, because those others would hurt that child. Those have misrepresentations, appropriations, bad content, factual errors. It's just the list of what goes wrong in children's books is pretty long. And so these are two of the graphics that I use when I'm talking and working with librarians and with teachers about what's out there in the libraries and in the bookstores that they will be able to draw from. In other words, they have to really develop some skills so they can make good choices.
Cool. Thank you, Debbie. You're already generating a lot of discussion in the chat, so it's exciting to see. So as we move forward, I know the next slide I think is just your blog that is available online. Pamela, if we could move forward one. Can you just quickly discuss how your blog came to be?
Oh, okay, sure. One of the things when you go to college to work on a doctorate, which is what I went to Illinois to do, is you're supposed to publish articles and book chapters in really fancy journals, not fancy, but the kinds of research journals that people think are like the best in the field, and that they're very elitist and they're very difficult to get published in, and they are almost unreadable because the academic jargon is very high, it's very dense. And I wanted my research to be available to librarians and teachers and parents and students in undergraduate courses. So I started this blog, American Indians and Children's Literature, in 2006 to make my analyses available to people so they could learn how to look at books the way that I was looking at books. And when you go through my site, there's way more not recommended books, but in particular, the not recommended books, I go really into detail, like line by line, page by page, chapter by chapter on what's wrong with the book. So it's become very instructional to other writers. So that's like my life's work. And that has brought me way more change in the field than all those articles that I have published in research journals and books. It is this blog that is changing practice in terms of writers and teaching and librarians and what they bring into their libraries and what they take out of their libraries, because that's important too, what you take out. What you're looking at there is the best books page. One thing that I try to do is find books that I think are worthy of being used, and I create the annual book lists. And so that page there is where you will find those kinds of lists.
Cool. Thank you so much for that introduction to your blog and kind of explaining more about your journey, talking about children's literature. I'll introduce Princess. So Princess is committed to practicing Native ways of life, sits on the board for Native Movement and Indian Collective. She has served on the SAG-AFTRA Native American Committee since 2007. And in 2015, she was appointed by President Obama to serve on the Board of Trustees for the Institute of American Indian Arts. She most recently served as creative producer and writer for the Peabody Award-winning PBS Kids series, Molly of Denali. She lives in Fairbanks, Alaska with her husband, James, their 3 boys, a sweet dog, and a furry bunny. I will turn it over to you, Princess.
Oh, gotta throw in the furry bunny. Shalaknai Shojita Jayoji Nets Aiguch in Ithli, Shiachanai Catherine, Stephen Peter Oji Gavakwa, Nets Aiguch in Ithli, Shidri Sho Ithli. My relations, my relatives, thank you so much for having me. My name is Princess Dajrai Johnson, and my grandparents are the late Catherine and Stephen Peter. My grandfather came from Arctic Village, Alaska, and my grandmother originally came from Stevens Village, Alaska. And I just wanted to start with all of this work is incredibly personal. And I wanted to start with a personal story of my childhood. And I remember growing up in the public school system in Alaska, and I had a very transient childhood, but I had this very strong, vivid memory of being in second grade, and I had long braids, and I was out on the playground, and two boys came along, two non-native boys, a blonde boy, and I can't remember the other boy, and they held my braids and were making the whip, the sound. And I was a very shy child, and I just remember having this incredible sense of shame, and like somehow I didn't matter in that situation. Like I just felt like I was a prop. As I, got older and, continued to go through the public education system, I learned nothing about us as Alaska Native people. And furthermore, I didn't have the word for it then, but retrospectively, I grew up with tons of racism and microaggressions towards me. And actually, if you want to, Clementine, if you can bring up that other black and white cartoon, I think it's the next slide, or image, comic image. I wanted, it's important for me to mention that because personally, I feel like our public education system has failed us all. I feel like it's a huge reason why we came to a place in 2016 where we elected the president that we did. And I think that it's a huge, reason why many of us as Indigenous people have felt invisible in our own homelands. And so these images that have come to us from the Black and, since the beginning of film and through the years and years of perpetuating the negative stereotypes and the really this notion that we don't exist anymore except for in the past as Indigenous people. The Cowboys and Indians movies continue to have a negative ramification on us. And I can certainly attest to, as an Indigenous woman, feeling a sense of low self-esteem, in large part due to these images that have been out internationally, giving people these mistaken notions of who we are as Indigenous people. And this also has ramifications on the policies set forth by our government that impact us. So with, that being said, we're at a different point in time right now, thankfully. I mean, woo, Deb Haaland. We have Deb Haaland running the Department of Interior. We have all of these amazing content creators who are Indigenous, and we have this, we're really flexing right now our grassroots political power and our ability to really tell our own stories finally. And so I just can't, I had this slide here when I first came on to Molly of Denali as the creative producer. I wanted to kind of go and look through all the images of us in animation. I went back and I saw those clips from Peter Pan, and I went and I looked at all these other examples, and I went, whoa, okay. We have so much work to do. And so I really think, and so thank you for bringing this up. This in particular, for those of you who haven't seen this show yet, if there's one story that you should watch from the show, I highly recommend watching Grandpa's Drum. And so I'm learning my language as I've had to learn my language as an adult. And of course, many of you are very familiar with the policies, the assimilationist policies of the United States government. My mother, who was sent to boarding school, her first language was Gwich'in. And she remembers very vividly being in line, and the matron asked her, "What kind of Indian are you?" And she was talking in Gwich'in to her friends there, trying to figure out, well, I'm Netzai, and I think you're Gwich'e, and like they're trying to figure out, what to say to her. And when she told her, I'm Gwich'in, she admonished her, and she's like, "You're not Gwich'in, you're Athabascan." Well, Athabascan is a linguistic group. So in any case, my mother was also hit with a ruler, for speaking our native language. And I did not know about this history until I went to my mother, probably at the age of about 13. And I said, "Why didn't you teach us Gwich'in? You all speak it fluently. Grandma wrote the dictionary in our language, and everyone, aunties and uncles, everyone speaks it fluently, but we don't speak it." And she said that's when she told me that she was hit for speaking her native language. And a lot of people don't recognize, like, that history is not so long ago. Oh, Siri thinks that I'm talking to her, sorry. And so in any case, yes, we had the opportunity to really address this history. And I think that what's important is, our children, we have to acknowledge their emotional intelligence, and that they're not too young to learn the true histories, and there's a way that we can present these things. And I'm so grateful that our elders that were involved with this series helped inform and validated that it's time for us to share our true history so we can heal from it and create the new, and that we're at this point of creating the new. So I know I feel like I'm rambling right now, but I wanted to kind of give that personal intro. Masi.
Princess, thank you so much for that great reflection, and Debbie as well. That I had thought of a couple of questions before hearing, before the panel started, but I had one that I think you both can touch on, is describing the importance of tribal sovereignty, tribal specificity, especially in children's literature. So I will hand it over to you, Debbie, to kind of just touch on the importance of tribal sovereignty and tribal specificity.
All righty. I was a professor, an assistant professor and a graduate student teaching in a college of education. And part of what I was observing then, and not all that aware of until later in my own development, was that Native people, indigenous people, were treated as a culture or cultures alongside other cultures or cultural groups in the United States. So like it was Native and African American, Asian American, and Latino. But when you think about the material culture, like food and clothing and things like that, and you create a grid or some way of comparing for students who are learning to be teachers, how to compare people across these different categories. The one category that's not there is sovereignty, because nobody has sovereignty except us. Nobody has sovereign nation status except us. And what I've understood over time is that that concept is really hard for people to understand. Well, what does that mean? You're sovereign. What does that mean? What do you mean you're a nation? And what I have found is the easiest way to explain that is that if people came up to Nambe Pueblo for a feast day, and they would drive from Santa Fe and they'd be coming north on the highway, and there would be a place where they would cross a sign that said entering Nambe Reservation. And if they were driving too fast, they would get pulled over by the tribal police. They would pay the ticket to the tribal judge. So we're suddenly there like in a different jurisdiction. You know, nobody else, African Americans can't give tickets like that. Latino, Asian, nobody can do that except us, because we have this long-standing status as nations who were nations before the United States was a nation. So our nationhood predates that. That's not taught. Kids learn about treaty, but it's kind of like it just flies by, because there's not enough information provided to them that, you know what, these native people, they were not the primitive, half-naked, animal-like creatures on the landscape that you have been taught. They had diplomacy, and that diplomacy was with the Spanish and with the Mexicans and with the Europeans. And we have ways to signify that diplomacy. With the Pueblos, that we have these canes that signify the relationship that we had with those sovereign nations. That's just not taught. And I have been emphasizing that a lot in the work that I do with teachers and librarians, that Native writers will bring that into their book in some way. So when you look at Cynthia Leitich-Smith's Jingle Dancer, she's got an author's note. First off, it's set in the present day. The character has a definite tribe. It's named in the book. And it pushes back against that idea that we don't exist anymore, because we are here. And people are very surprised that we're here and we wear clothing like everybody else, like jeans and t-shirts. Somehow there's this perception that if we don't dress like we did 300 or 400 or 500 years ago, then we're not really Native anymore, which is stupid. Americans don't dress like the Puritans, duh. But so trying to help people see the movement over time and try to help them understand that sovereignty makes us very different from everybody else. And that one of the things that that Princess said that really resonated with me is that we're invisible on our own homelands, because to most people, if we're not wearing feathers and fringe and buckskin, then we're not really Native, because they identify us or categorize us by a physical artifact like that, rather than our status as nations. So any Native writer that brings that into their book, I'm like, yes, let's look at this book, look at this page, let's talk about that. All these things that I hit on with that tribal sovereignty and being tribally specific. Because with one other thing that a teacher can do with a book like Jingle Dancer is they'll hold that book up and they'll say, Cynthia Leitich-Smith is Muskogee Creek. That little word is, it's not was, it's not were, it's is, because we're here. And they can also say, Cynthia is an enrolled citizen of the Muskogee Nation. So right away, it's like, what does that mean, citizen? Well, that means she has a nation and she can vote at her nation. And you know, the opportunities to teach and talk about sovereignty just are exponentially growing when you're using a book by a Native writer. And so she has those things in her book that I really highlight a lot, because they matter. They matter. I think some setting is bumping. Yeah. I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here talking.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. I don't have the ability to unmute myself when I mute myself. So in Zoom habit, I mute myself. Princess, if you can expand on the idea of tribal sovereignty and tribal specificity, but also narrative sovereignty, especially within children's stories and children's literature.
Well, I think one of the things that I learned, I remember I was on a panel with some folks from the ABC in Australia, and I was really happy to learn from them. Now, Australia and also Canada First Nations have documents like pathways and protocols for engaging and working with First Nations and in Canada and the Aboriginal groups in Australia. But at the ABC, which I guess is sort of the state-run television network there, it is a non-starter. If you come in as a non-native, non-Aboriginal person and you have content that you're pitching a show or storyline that features Aboriginal people, they won't even take a meeting with you. And I was like, wow, you all are like ahead of the game. Like, that's really amazing. And I think when we think of narrative sovereignty, that's really the direction that I'd like to see the states head in, is really being thoughtful about who is creating these shows and why are they creating these shows. And I think that's, I mean, the question of why, of course, I think it's something we should all be asking ourselves as any content creator. But that is certainly something that I would like to see happening. And I think we are shifting in that direction. And I also like to uphold like the good examples. And so I'm really excited about Spirit Rangers, Netflix's Spirit Rangers. That's going to be coming out in 2022. I'm excited about that show. There's also some good shows. I had a resource list that I shared that I hope we'll be able to share with those that are watching. Out of Canada, there was Wapos Bay, which is a really fun like claymation series. And then there was also Loretta Todd, Coyote's Crazy Science Kid, I think is what it's called, or science show. It's super fun and it highlights Indigenous knowledge. And so I just think that these are really exciting and important steps towards narrative sovereignty. And I'm so excited. I just heard about Rutherford Falls, which I know is not children's, but it's, Native led. And this is it's such an amazing time. And I'm so exciting and really like cheering everybody on from the sidelines, all these shows.
I also just saw the trailer for Rutherford Falls, and I'm excited about a comedy. I think that's really, really, it drops April 22nd on, I think, Peacock. So be sure to look out for it. So one thing I think both of you in your discussion of materials that are being produced and the excitement of the tribal specific materials that are being produced, I think it's really important, Debbie, what you said about somebody being their tribal nation. They are not was, right? It's not a historicized or put in the past. What is your reflection on this past year during the pandemic? And we'll start with you, Princess, and I know you have 3 children and have had to, deal with online learning and the amount of resources or lack of resources. So if you could just discuss kind of those issues.
Yeah, no, thanks for mentioning that, because like many people probably in right now watching, I was not prepared to transition to homeschooling my kids. And so when that happened, we went through a program, and now some of these online, my son is on a program called Acellus, and some of these online programs, they're like really, I mean, they weren't expecting to see an influx of hundreds of thousands more people using these online programs. But one of the things I noticed right away was they were really, when it came to the social studies, now my 10-year-old's in 5th grade, speaking about Indigenous people in the past, relegating us to the past. Right before we went to the homeschool, though, he was online, and his teacher was talking about Christopher Columbus, and my ears perked up. I'm like, oh, how are they talking about Christopher Columbus these days? And I heard her say that he discovered America. And I was on my own Zoom, and later I wrote a long email to her, and I'm like, I think I heard you say this, and these are all the reasons why I don't agree with that. And there's another way to present this material. And she's like, oh, you couldn't see me, but I used air quotes. Discovered. And I was like, well, I don't think my son would have caught on to that you were using the air quotes. So it was good. We had a good discussion, but all that to say, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that these programs that are out there, the books that Debbie recommends, and, for me personally, like, I'm fortunate enough that people like my grandmother wrote down some of our traditional stories, and we have it both in Gwich'in and in English. And, I think as a parent, if we have the time, it's really important that we get our children out on the land as much as we are supplementing what they're learning, whether it be at school or online, with literature that it's place-based and that we're connecting them to these customs. Yeah.
Well, I don't have anybody at home right now. My daughter is 30, so it's just me and my husband hanging out in our spaces. But of course, I'm observing a lot that's going on with education and people that I follow in who do have young children. And one of the things that seems to be persistent, and I'm glad to have a chance to talk about that, is when you, Princess just mentioned traditional stories. Those are sacred stories. Those are origin stories. Those are creation stories. And all of our tribal nations have those stories, but they get treated as folktales. If you go to most libraries, you will find that in the card catalog online now, of course, the subject field will include folklore. And so it gets put over there with like folk and fairy tales, like Little Red Riding Hood and Jack and the Beanstalk and those things. And when they're shelved that way, they lose their significance and their importance. So when I do workshops, I bring up examples of that. I show people native traditional stories that have that catalog field as a folktale. And then I say, now let's look at Noah's Ark, because that's a Christian sacred story, but it doesn't have folktale in the field. So you can see examples of the institutional racism or anti-Indigenous institutionalized ways of talking about who we are when you look at those stories that are why we're here, why we're all still here telling those stories, because they are about our creation. So I thought about that as you were talking, but I also thought about what you said about Columbus. And this book came out this year. I'm not sure how well these are going to be able to show as I hold them up, but this is Peggy Flanagan. It's a biography about Peggy Flanagan, who is Lieutenant Governor in Minnesota, and it's a biography of her. And so it starts out with her childhood, like books do, when you're looking at a biography. And there's this page here. Can you see that? Where she's talking about remembering when her teacher was doing the Who Discovered America lesson and how that felt to her, and that she was on the playground and she was thinking about what her teacher just said, and what was the teacher going to say when they went back in after recess, and that I think as an opening piece to that particular book is really important, because I don't think teachers understand that when they do that, even if they're doing air quotes, even if they're trying to break it down in some way, the native kid is hearing it in one way, and the rest of the kids are like, whatever, it's just more of the same old stuff. But a native kid is carrying a tremendous weight from that moment when their teacher said something about them that they know is not right. And what do? Most native kids are taught to be respectful to adults, and that includes their teachers. And so they're in this moment like, what am I going to do? The teacher got it wrong. And it gets even worse when there's a test, a comprehension test, and they have to answer that question with information they know is wrong, or else their answer is wrong. So I really like to push teachers to think very hard about those kinds of activities and lessons and what that does to Native kids. And I try to say, okay, now let's go look at the statistics on dropout rates among Native students. They're high. And it's no surprise that kids drop out of school when this is what they get from their teachers who are supposed to be educating them. They're being harmed. So those are a couple of the things that I was thinking about as you were answering her question, Princess. Thank you. This is great, being able to.
Yeah, to have the back and forth. And I think I would love to, we have some questions in the chat, but before we get to those, I want to just first expand on this benefit of having Native material for Native children that actually benefits everybody. And so if there are stories or ways that you both could push folks towards, what stories would you like to see more of, or ones that have succeeded in this realm of children's literature? And we'll go back to you, Debbie, and then to Princess.
When I am recommending books, I definitely say look for Native writers, because I do believe that Native people, for the most part, understand certain things about the ways that we as Native people talk about our own communities. For example, the libraries across the country are full of books, full of stories that were collected by white men who went into our communities in the 1800s and recorded what they saw and what they heard and what they thought was what was going on. And it wasn't. It's a misrepresentation, but those things have a life way beyond those moments of collection. They were bad then, and they become worse when they get used as a resource to tell a story. And a person who's not Native may not understand that. Native people understand, you know, those things are messed up. So I really prefer Native writers because they know what to share and what not to share. That's also important. That and coming back to Jingle Dancer, one of the things that teachers like to use a lot is these folk tales, this folklore, this myth, this legend. And I really want them to just go step away from that. Don't do that. Look for books that are set in the present day. So coming back to Jingle Dancer again, I should have had a copy handy. But anyway, in Jingle Dancer, there's a part where the little girl is having a hard time. She's going to do the jingle dance for the first time, and her grandma has a TV and a VCR and you know, all these modern things. It's set in the present day, obvious markers of that life as contemporary people. But there is there's a point where the little girl's feeling a little overwhelmed, and one of the women in her community tells her about Bat. Remember Bat? And she's referring to a Muskogee story about Bat. And the little girl already knows the story because sometime in her life, someone has told her that story. It doesn't have to be in the book. All that needs to happen is that the adult character can say, remember Bat? And she remembers that. It kicks in this teaching that she's had. And she can go on, she can carry on. So books set in the present day because Native writers know what they're doing. And yeah, I think that's what I emphasize the most is present day Native writers.
Princess, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, you know, one of the things Debbie mentioned earlier is just that we want our experience to be validated as Indigenous people. We want to be able to see something that we can really relate to on the screen. And I think that there's also something that's very healing about that. I love seeing the use of our Indigenous languages. I saw, you know, Cherokee now has a series that's, I don't know if it's already available or not, that's totally in the language. And I just saw there's a new show on Netflix called City of Ghosts. And actually Pam, I think, might know the backstory to this particular episode more than I do, but I watched one of the stories called Tovangar. Did you watch that one? It's so beautiful. I was crying when I watched it, and I knew that they must have, I think Pam hooked them up with some people from the area, but it was so beautiful because it connected so well our Indigenous values. And that's something that I always talk about. Like, I really think the world needs our Indigenous values, that reminder that we have to be good relatives to one another, but not just to one another, but the non-human. We have to be good relatives to the water. We have to be good relatives to the plants and animals that we share, right, our Mother Earth with. And this story in particular, I really suggest people go watch this particular story because it was so well done. And I was so moved. Pam, you might know more about the backstory of it than I do. I know the creator, I believe, is Japanese American, but she must have worked with some people on that.
I want to circle back to what you were talking about, the water. Because this year, for the first time ever, a not white woman won the most important prize in children's literature, the Caldecott Award. That was Michaela Goad. She won it for a book called We Are Water Protectors. And it's all about Native people standing up to protect the water. And those of you, and I bet the people here who are at the UCLA American Indian Studies program, you all know what was going on there. And when you pick up that picture book and you start, you study the cover, and we all have that image in our minds of a young Native woman on her knees holding that feather up in front of the police line, right? I mean, we're familiar with that. And we see that in the book, except we see her from the front. The little girl is you see her from the front facing the line. And behind her, You see all the people that were gathered there holding hands. You know, that was also an image that was coming from Standing Rock, was the holding hands as we were all there together to resist. And it's a remarkable book in many, many ways, for the story it tells, but also that it won that award. And I celebrate that award. And at the same time, I'm like, I almost cussed. At the same time, I want to say, you know what? This is all on our homelands. For hundreds of years, Europeans have dug up our ancestors' graves because they thought, oh, this is good art. I want this art. I'm collecting this art. I'm putting it in my house. I'm putting it in this museum or that museum. They have valued Native art for centuries. But Native children's book writers and illustrators are having a hard time getting in those doors. That has to stop. And one way that really stops is by people, how many people are here today? 215, according to the participants number on the bottom. Every one of you has to buy more than one copy of We Are Water Protectors, more than one copy of every single book that I recommend, because sadly, money drives the publishing industry in the United States. And if those books don't get bought, then publishing will think, well, we don't need any more of those books. They don't sell. So we all have to be activist consumers, maybe, in what we choose to bring into our homes.
Yeah, I think that's a great, one of the audience members had a question if you could share native focused publishers. And then I would just say, like, any other books that had just come out that you would like to share. I think City of Ghosts was beautiful. You know, living as an uninvited guest in Tovangnar for 10 years, it really brought like so much joy to my heart to see, you know, Craig Torres and other folks, Tongva folks, telling their own stories about the water and about place. I would definitely shout out to City of Ghosts, and it is a wonderful animation. But yes, so if there are Native focused publishers, and any suggestions you might have of where folks can find children's literature.
I tend not to say this or that publisher, because then the assumption is that all their books are going to be fine, and it's not the case. There's always something that's not. But the one that I am going to talk about is Heart Drum, and I'm going to do this thing again. I'm going to push this book way up close so you can see that feather and the word Heart Drum. This is the result of a partnership, or not really a partnership, but a collaboration between, and I don't know, Cynthia Leidig-Smith is in my head today, but Cynthia has been working in children's literature as a writer, but also as a mentor for a lot of other Native writers for as long as I've been studying children's books. And that has finally evolved into a major publisher, HarperCollins, deciding that they will have an imprint that will be dedicated to Native writers. So that's what Heart Drum is. And their first books are coming out this year. And the one that I showed you is Jojo McCoon's, and this is by Don Quigley. It hasn't come out yet. I have an advanced copy of the book, but it's the kind of thing that is written for kids who are learning to read independently. You know, it's kind of like an I can read book. I'll just kind of show some of that. There's not a whole lot of text on the pages, and there's illustrations in there. And this is a Ojibwe girl. And it's so much superior to the early I can read books that are out there right now, because you'll find like Danny and the Dinosaur, and you'll find The Night in the Museum, these books that have stereotypical Native content in them. But this is a new one. This is good. And so I'm very interested in what's coming from Heart Drum, because they are Native writers that are publishing there, and Cynthia's doing some good things there.
Some other suggestions from some of the audience members of Oyate Press, Heyday Press. I know there's a new, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I know there's a group of Dakota writers that are trying to start a publication.
Marlene Miles.
Yes.
Yes, I saw that. That's outstanding.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about these. Like you said, we can't, trust that every story is going to be the best story, but the fact that they're coming out. A quick question for you, Debbie. Is there a new infographic for 2020 or 2021 for the diverse books?
No.
Children's books? Not yet?
No, not yet.
Okay. And then some folks asked if you have any suggestions for audiobooks, especially that utilize native languages.
The audiobooks that come to mind are the ones by Eric Gansworth. He is Onondaga, and he writes for middle grade and young adult readers. And he is one of the writers who records his own audiobooks. And when I read his book and then I listen to the audiobook, it is like a different experience, because the things that I emphasize in my own head and heart are not the things that he emphasizes. And so I get another take on the story that he's telling in his books. Another thing that's really interesting for me about Eric and his books, and this is, he grew up in New York. I grew up in New Mexico. They're like opposite ends of the country, but we both grew up on reservations. And a lot of the things that we experience as Native people on reservations are similar, even though we're so far apart. And so his books resonate with me in ways that books that are by Native writers who grew up in the city don't, because I didn't have that experience. So I think it's a good thing to be aware of the range of experience and how that's being written and sold in children's books. So his audiobooks are good. I don't know of any audiobooks completely in a native language. I bet there's some though.
Any thoughts, Princess?
Well, I don't know, who all's in the audience, but, for parents and educators, I do recommend going to the PBS Learning Media website, because there are some really lovely accompanying curriculum for some of the Grandpa's Drum and some of the other Molly stories that are really good. And I also wanted to recommend Deb's book, actually, her adaptation for the Indigenous Peoples' History for Young Adults, which I think, again, we need to know these true histories, and we need to have that shared understanding of history. And then for anyone in the audience who is an animator or filmmaker, I know that LA Skins Fest has now been doing a number of animation labs. Sundance has their program. There goes my puppy dog, opening the door on us. And there's just so many resources, and it's just so good to really to know that we're all, as Deb said, changing practice, and systemic change can take a lot of work, but just us being able to share resources and have this dialogue is a huge part of that.
Yeah, I think this has been really productive. So we had some more questions from the audience. Someone asked Deb particularly if she could speak about the American Indian Youth Literature Awards and just talk about that.
Yes, the American Indian Library Association established years ago. We wrote up the criteria on how we would determine what books would be deserving of an award that the association gave out, and so that came into being. And if you do on my best books page, I also link to the American Indian Library Association's award-winning books. Every 2 years, the American Indian Library Association gives out its Youth Media Literature Award. It's a mouthful, it's a lot of words there, but they are books that have been selected by librarians that are members of the association. And I recommend that you look up their website and you look up the books that they have that have won their award.
Thank you. And just if those of you who aren't following the chat, Pamela said she will compile the references, because there's a very wide range of references that are happening right now, but she will compile them. And if you had signed up through Eventbrite, she will share out from the talk today all the references that are being shared. So we have some more questions. I find this one really fascinating. Is it better to put all, religious stories that might be considered myth or legends as sacred stories or religious text? Or does it not matter as long as Indigenous stories are given the same respect as Christian ones? So I think this will be interesting to hear from both of you. I think about Debbie, when you said earlier that our stories are sacred to us, right? And so how should our stories be treated? Should they not be shared? What are the ones that can be shared? And I would like to hear from both of you on this.
I guess that I would like Bible stories to get tagged as folk stories, as stories of the people. It basically is what folklore is. It's stories of the people, because that just like decenters whiteness and Christianity in a major way, to like just say, you don't get that special space on the shelf. you come over here and be the people, because that's what you are. You're people with stories about how you came to be here. And I think that's what I would do if I was running a library. I think that's what I would do.
I love that idea. And, I think that when I think about our traditional stories and how often I will see like a science journal come out with some big finding, an article, and it's like, oh, the trees talk to each other. Yeah, the trees talk to each other and they have offspring. And this is something Indigenous people have known and we've written about. And well, of course, and I'm really grateful. I'm grateful for my grandmother and all of our, elders who were, they had that foresight that we needed to record these stories and, write them down for future generations. And I know I look at those texts all the time. And in fact, I don't have it right here with me, but a tribal member, wrote down, some of our really sacred stories. And I was just so filled with gratitude because there were so many teachings and within that story that I just wouldn't have known otherwise. So I think that there's a place for it. And when we do it in our own language and on our own terms, that's when it makes the difference. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I always hear my parents talk about teaching federal Indian law as fiction. So I think it's really important, Debbie. I think that's a lovely idea of talking about Bible stories as folktale. So we're getting a lot of questions rolling in, so I'm trying to find what are your thoughts about digital books? And then also, if you have any suggestions about Native-owned bookstores or online resources that folks can support. Either or, Debbie or Princess, if you have any suggestions.
Princess, since you have little kids, can you talk about whether or not they use electronic books?
Mm. They don't use electronic books. We have all hardcover. Yeah. Oh, that's okay. With the exception of, we have some members from my community, including my cousin Rochelle Adams, were a part of a project where they translated English children's books into Gwich'in. And sometimes we will watch some of those, like I think is it Black Bear, the Eric Carle, like Hungry Caterpillar, and yeah, there's a number of books that they translated. So that's the exception, is like we have listened to those and watched them.
So you have those as electronic books that you can look at, like on a Kindle?
No, it's just on a YouTube. Yeah. So I've never used a Kindle before. Yeah.
Okay. Kindles don't work that well for picture books. I do have a lot of them. I do prefer to get them that way, because then I can find them. Because otherwise I have piles everywhere as it is. I'm not very organized, and I can always find something on my Kindle. But you can't see very well. The quality is not as good as having the actual book. So it depends on the book. I think picture books are better made available to kids in hardcover or paperback. And novels, of course, that's different. I'm not sure what the question was, but that's where I went with it.
Yeah, just suggestions for digital books. And I think both of your reflections on the use of digital books, especially by youth. And then also if you have any suggestions for Native-owned bookstores. So I know there's Birch Bark Books, but if there are any that you could suggest.
Lee Francis has a bookstore in Albuquerque. I'm going to say it wrong because I don't have it in front of me, but it might be Red Planet Books. Maybe somebody, is that what it is? Okay. Yeah, those are the only two Indigenous owned bookstores that I know of. There are many more in Canada. There's so much more happening in Canada than there is in the United States. Canada, the Canadian government subsidizes small presses. And so there's way more wonderful books that are done by Indigenous owned bookstores and publishers in Canada than there is down here. Their numbers blow us out of the water. They just do way more, much better.
Yeah, Red Planet Books and Comic Books, which is in Albuquerque, I believe. And then also here in Rapid City, South Dakota is Birdcage Books that just opened up this summer. So Birdcage is another one here. I just posted the Facebook. Whoops, I accidentally sent that to someone else. I'll put it in for everyone. Oh, I'm getting so inundated. Another question is, how about any references for comic books or graphic novels?
I have a list on my website. So if you go to my website in my best books tab, there should be a comics book list there because there are some terrific graphic novels being done by Native writers and creators. So I do like, one of my favorites is Super Indian by Aragon Starr. I took that to Santa Clara Pueblo 5 years ago, and I was doing a workshop there with the teachers and the kids in the day school there. And after that, I went to the library to rest for a little while, and there come the kids. They wanted to see Super Indian. I mean, they were like, they followed me to find it so they could get it and look at it. And they sat there and they were just like transfixed with it because it was like, it resonates with them. Aragon Starr does just great work with her Super Indian series. So I like that a lot.
And Aragon is going to be having, Native Voices is putting up Super Indian as an audio performance. And I forget the date. It's April. If you guys look up Native Voices at the Autry, you'll find the information. There you go. Yep. The other thing that just came out was Marvel did the Indigenous Voices comic, which I also scooped up, and I was just looking for it. I'm like, I just had it. And who knows? Thankfully, you guys can't see my desk. It's a mess.
Yes, one of the Tongva artists, Vishoya Alvitri, was one of the artists for the Marvel series. So it's really exciting to see these voices uplifted. So we just have time for a couple more questions. I think a couple folks have asked for Debbie's recommendations for cataloging Native stories from Native authors, or suggestions for librarians about how to catalog these stories in these books.
Yeah, that's always an interesting conversation that can get rather tense when we're talking about books by Native or African American, by any underrepresented or marginalized group. They where to shelve them. Should they all be by themselves over in one corner so that a child of that particular group can easily find those books? And I say, yes, do that, and put them, another copy somewhere else in the library. Duplicate copies of these books is what I try to say, because they need to be bought and they need to be found easily by Native people, but they also need to be found just by happenstance by readers who are looking through the stacks or the bookshelves.
Thank you. It's a really, I think library scientists have tough jobs ahead of them, and especially the legacy of how things were cataloged prior and the things that our librarians have to deal with now. So in our last few minutes, an audience shared a question that I think is a great question to end on, is what would you want educators to know when they teach literature by Native peoples? And I think for both of you, you know, Princess, your work with Molly of Denali, and Debbie, your extensive work for your resources and your blog. What is the one thing you would want educators to know, to move forward with, to challenge themselves with?
Princess, go ahead.
That's a really challenging question. You know, one of the things, I'm on the board of Native Movement, and a lot of times we do trainings that one of the trainings is titled Untangling Colonialism. And I think it's really important for educators in particular to understand the history of colonization and how that is perpetuated to this day. And knowing how the education system has played part and parcel in perpetuating really racism and white supremacist thinking. And so I think that's important. And, you know, being able to have these open dialogues, you know, with Indigenous people, this format sort of thing, that's important as well. I do a lot of work in the in-service locally, just talking to educators about this exact subject, and you know, how they can utilize resources in their classroom. And again, you know, once you're in the classroom, like with the kids, and they get to see themselves, and just even the opportunity to share what their name means, where it came from, wherever they came from, right, in the world, and then share a little bit of their language. It's just so validating to feel seen, right? That culturally like responsive education. I'm not sure what else to say about that.
I think that teachers have to know the ground that they stand on, the land that the school is located on, because there's a tendency to just kind of do whatever. And I think it's important that they be very careful about what they're doing, that they know what nation there was on that land, or where that nation is now. And I think they have to own the knowledge, because I think they tend to push that aside to someone else made me do this kind of thing. And I think, no, you are a professional, and you have a degree, and you are entrusted with the education that happens in your classroom. So one of the recommendations that I think is really important is, if you are in Ojibwe homelands, that teachers read 100 Ojibwe books or 200 Ojibwe books. Read all the books that Louise Erdrich has ever written, and the ones that other Ojibwe writers have written, because then you become immersed in that people and their stories. And then when you read a children's book that has something in it that's supposed to be about them, you can say, nope, that's not going to fly. And you can push it aside and say something. And I guess the other piece I would say is, I really wish teachers would like share their learning online in public spaces. So when they have decided that they're not going to use Little House on the Prairie because it has X, Y, and Z problems, that they use social media to say that. Because it provides a model for other teachers to learn, to say, yeah, you know, I was doing that and I shouldn't do that anymore. And I'm so glad that person said that. I agree, and I'm going to retweet it, and I'm not going to use it anymore either. What I have discovered in the last 5 years or so is how powerful social media is. I mean, it's scary for sure, because all kinds of terrible things happen on social media, but good things are also happening, because people are using it in activist modes to say, this book is not okay. And we have in the last 5 years seen books get pulled by the publishers, children's books pulled by the publishers, because there's just too much pushback on them, and they recognize, you know, this is not going to work, and they pull those books. And that just doesn't happen. Publishers rarely do that, but it is happening because people are speaking up. So I would encourage, that's one thing I would really say, is speak up and say something. And before we forget, I also want to say thank you very much, Pamela Peters and the UCLA American Indian Studies Center, for setting this all up, because it has been a great hour and 10 minutes, I guess, and it let me get to know Princess.
Yeah.
So this has all just been terrific.
You just sparked my memory with what you said. My son in second grade, for the Thanksgiving presentation, second grade, they had them with the cutout Pilgrim and Indians thing. And, you know, myself and the head of our Alaska Native Ed at that time brought it up to the principal. And the next year, and this was so meaningful, the next year, those teachers that gave that presentation corrected themselves. They did their research. And at the top of the presentation, they talked about why they needed to change the program and how that came about. And I was crying as a parent, because that's what I grew up with. And that's where our nation is at, is that we're still trying to change this indoctrination and get to this place. So, you know, it is important to acknowledge that. And then we learn, we're like, oh, okay, there's another better way to be doing, you know, presenting this information and these materials. So yes. And Pam, thank you, Masicho, so much to you all, UCLA American Indian Studies program. I hope that you continue to create space like this for us to feel seen, to dialogue, to share resources and all this important information. Masicho.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to moderate. I think as a child of K through 8 educators, it's really exciting to be able to have and witness this conversation. And as you've all said, thank you to the UCLA American Indian Studies Center for organizing and hosting. And I will turn it back over to you, Pam, to close us out.
Thank you all. Thank you, Princess. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Clementine, for just an amazing conversation this afternoon. Before I close, I actually wanted to know, Shannon, do you want to say a few words before I do my closing?
Hi, everyone.
There you go.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, that's disorienting. I just want to say thank you. Thank you to everyone for being here. Thanks so much to our participants. This was just a wonderful, wonderful event, and we appreciate you very much.
Well, this concludes our afternoon discussion, and thank you very much for participating.